A bus driver allows himself to cross all boundaries by throwing a black girl to the curb. But this story isn't over. Her response silenced everyone. Find out how fortitude and determination can change everything. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment. Where are you watching this video from? Amara woke up to the faint glimmer of morning light filtering through the thin curtains of her room. The sky was still gray, tinged with a muted pink, and the world outside was calm, wrapped in a chill that only early mornings could bring. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on her even before she'd left her bed. Every morning was the same. She'd dress, eat a quick breakfast, and stand by the side of the road hoping the school bus would stop for her. As she stood in front of her mirror, brushing her hair, her mind was already wandering outside to the curb. Today might be different, she thought. Maybe Mr. Jenkins wouldn't ignore her again. Maybe he'd actually open the doors and let her on without the usual disdainful glance. But even as she thought it, she could feel the pang of doubt. She knew Mr. Jenkins' pattern all too well. Downstairs, her mother, Linda, was making breakfast, the smell of toast and scrambled eggs filling the small but cozy kitchen. Linda worked as a journalist, and every morning before she went off to the office, she made sure Amara had a warm meal and everything she needed for school. Their conversations were usually short but meaningful. Linda always had a piece of advice or a word of encouragement to share. This morning, Amara could see the familiar look of concern on her mother's face as she walked into the kitchen. "Good morning, sweetheart," Linda said, offering a small smile. "Are you ready for school?" Amara nodded, her expression tense. "Yeah, I'm ready. Just hoping the bus comes for me today." Linda's eyes flickered, but she didn't press the matter. They'd had the conversation before, many times. She knew Amara was handling something difficult, but she trusted her daughter to come to her when she was ready. Instead, she patted Amara's hand and placed a warm plate of eggs and toast in front of her. "Just remember, Amara," Linda said, her voice soft but steady, "you don't have to let anyone make you feel small. You deserve the same respect as anyone else." Amara nodded, her eyes downcast. She appreciated her mother's words, but she couldn't shake the nervousness building inside her. She ate in silence, her mind drifting back to the curb outside, picturing the bright yellow school bus lumbering down the road. The way her heart would race each time it appeared around the corner. Would today be different? After breakfast, Amara pulled on her backpack and kissed her mother goodbye. She stepped outside, the crisp morning air biting her cheeks, and walked the familiar path to the curb just a few yards from her front door. She adjusted her backpack straps, her fingers trembling slightly as she clutched the straps tightly. She was alone, as always. No other children waited on this street. They all lived closer to the school, leaving her as the lone figure waiting on the edge of the neighborhood. As the minutes ticked by, Amara's eyes scanned the distance, watching for the first hint of the school bus. The street was silent except for the occasional car passing by, and she could feel her heart rate quicken as each second passed. She hated this feeling of uncertainty, of vulnerability. She wanted to be strong, to brush off Mr. Jenkins' behavior, but the sting of being left behind, of being overlooked, never failed to hurt. Finally, she spotted the bus, a hulking yellow figure trundling down the road, growing larger and larger as it approached. Her heart leapt, and she took a small step forward, raising her hand just slightly, as if to signal to the driver. But as the bus came nearer, her hope faltered. She could already see him. Mr. Jenkins, his face impassive, eyes fixed straight ahead as though she didn't even exist. Amara's hand dropped to her side, her chest tightening. The bus rolled closer, and for a moment, she thought he would stop, that maybe, just maybe, he would finally acknowledge her. But instead, he drove past her, his gaze fixed forward, the bus rumbling on as if she were invisible. A surge of disappointment washed over her, a familiar ache settling in her chest. She watched the bus disappear down the street, the sound of its engine fading into the distance. She was left alone, standing by the curb, a lump forming in her throat. She clenched her fists, fighting back the tears threatening to spill. She'd done this before. She could handle it. She had to. Turning on her heel, Amara began the long walk to school. She knew it would take her nearly an hour, but she had no choice. Her mother had offered to drive her, of course, but Amara had always refused, determined to handle this on her own. It was a matter of pride, of proving to herself that she didn't need to rely on anyone. As she walked, her mind wandered to her classmates, wondering what they'd say if they knew about her situation. She imagined the pity in their eyes, the questions, the whispers. No, it was better to keep it to herself. She didn't want to be seen as the girl who couldn't even get a ride on the bus. When Amara finally arrived at school, her legs ached and her feet felt heavy. She took a deep breath, straightening her shoulders as she entered the building. She greeted her friends with a smile, masking her exhaustion, her pride keeping her from revealing the morning's ordeal. The rest of the day passed in a blur of classes and whispered conversations in the hallways. Amara tried to focus on her studies, throwing herself into her schoolwork as a way to escape the nagging feeling of inadequacy. But no matter how hard she tried, the thought of Mr. Jenkins' dismissive stare lingered in her mind, casting a shadow over her every thought. After school, Amara dreaded the long walk home, but she steeled herself, reminding herself that she was strong enough to handle it. She gathered her things and began the trek back, her mind already bracing for another lonely morning tomorrow. When she finally returned home, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over their small house. Linda was waiting for her in the kitchen, her eyes soft with concern. "How was your day, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Amara forced a smile. "It was fine, Mom. Just the usual." Linda nodded, her gaze lingering on Amara for a moment, as if she could see through the facade, but she didn't press the matter. She simply wrapped an arm around Amara's shoulders and pulled her close. "You know," Linda said quietly, "I'm proud of you. You're strong and brave, and no one can take that from you." Amara felt a swell of emotion rise in her chest. She knew her mother meant every word, and it gave her a small measure of comfort, a glimmer of hope that maybe, someday, things would be different. As she lay in bed that night, Amara stared at the ceiling, replaying the morning in her mind. She could still see the bus rolling past her, could still feel the sting of rejection, but beneath the sadness a spark of determination flickered. She wasn't going to let Mr. Jenkins or anyone else make her feel small. She was going to keep fighting, keep standing at that curb every morning, no matter how many times he ignored her. Because one day, she told herself, things would change. One day, she'd make sure of it. The morning routine didn't get easier. In fact, each day felt harder for Amara. She stood by the curb, her figure small against the backdrop of the gray morning sky, watching with a mixture of hope and fear as the yellow school bus rolled toward her. Every time she saw Mr. Jenkins' face, her stomach twisted, and today was no different. She raised her hand just slightly, a silent request to be led on, to be recognized. But Mr. Jenkins didn't so much as glance her way. His eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead as he drove past her, leaving her standing alone on the edge of the sidewalk. A familiar pang of disappointment sank in her chest, but she clenched her fists, refusing to let the tears come. It was easier to walk to school than to let him see how much his indifference hurt her. Amara's walk to school became a daily ritual, a long trek that left her exhausted before the first bell even rang. She couldn't bring herself to tell anyone, not even her closest friends. She was too proud, too afraid of being seen as weak or pitiful. So every day she walked, her mind filled with a whirl of emotions, frustration, anger, and a deep sadness she tried to ignore. But ignoring her feelings was becoming harder. Mr. Jenkins wasn't just passing by without a glance anymore. He seemed to go out of his way to humiliate her. One morning, she had managed to catch up to the bus at a stoplight. She stood on the sidewalk, close enough to see Mr. Jenkins' face through the glass. She thought he might open the door, that maybe he'd acknowledge her presence, just this once. Instead, he looked her way, a smirk twisting his lips. Then he leaned over, closed the door firmly, and sped off the moment the light turned green, leaving her standing there, humiliated and stunned. A few students in the back seats had seen what happened, and their laughter echoed in her ears as the bus pulled away. Amara felt a wave of shame rise within her, her cheeks burning as she turned and began her long walk once more. She couldn't understand why he was treating her this way, what she had done to deserve his disdain. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of her humiliation pressing down on her. School itself was a different kind of challenge. She tried to put on a brave face, to act as though nothing was wrong. Her classmates didn't know about her struggles with Mr. Jenkins, and she wanted to keep it that way. She wanted to be seen as strong, unbothered, someone who could handle anything thrown her way. But her friend Elijah began to notice the changes. They'd been friends since elementary school, sharing a bond that was both comforting and unspoken. Elijah was quiet and thoughtful, often able to read her mood without her having to say a word. One afternoon, as they sat together in the library, he finally voiced his concern. "Amara, are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. "You've seemed different lately." She glanced at him, her heart thumping in her chest. She didn't want to tell him, didn't want to admit the vulnerability that lurked beneath her carefully composed exterior. But Elijah's gaze was warm, full of understanding, and she found herself wavering. "It's nothing," she replied, forcing a smile. "Just tired, I guess." He studied her for a moment, his brow furrowing. "You know, you can tell me if something's wrong. I'm here for you." Amara's smile faltered, and for a brief moment she considered opening up, telling him about Mr. Jenkins and the humiliation she faced each morning. But the words stuck in her throat, and she shook her head. "It's fine, really," she insisted. "I can handle it." Elijah didn't press further, but she could see the worry in his eyes. She turned away, burying herself in her schoolwork, hoping that would be enough to distract him and herself from the pain she was carrying. Days turned into weeks, and Mr. Jenkins' behavior only grew worse. He seemed to relish the small, cutting ways he could make her feel small, his actions laced with a cold indifference that stung deeply. Sometimes he would pause at the curb, letting her think he was going to open the door, only to close it at the last second and drive off, leaving her humiliated and alone. Amara tried to tell herself it didn't matter, that she was strong enough to endure his cruelty. But each incident left a scar, a small wound that festered in her heart, growing with each passing day. She hated the way he looked at her, the way he dismissed her as though she were invisible, unworthy of even a shred of respect. One morning, as she stood by the curb, waiting once again, she felt a familiar dread settle in her stomach. The bus appeared down the road, its yellow frame looming larger with every passing second. She braced herself, preparing for the inevitable moment when Mr. Jenkins would drive by without a second glance. But this time was different. This time, he stopped, his face impassive as he opened the door. For a brief, hopeful moment, Amara thought he was going to let her on, that maybe he'd had a change of heart. She took a step forward, her hand reaching for the rail. Then, just as her foot touched the step, he smirked, his gaze cold and unyielding. With a flick of his wrist, he closed the door sharply, the edge of it brushing against her fingers. Amara stumbled back, her hand throbbing with pain as she watched him pull away, the bus disappearing into the distance. She stood there, stunned, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the sting of tears in her eyes, but she forced them back, swallowing hard. She wouldn't let him see her cry. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. When she arrived at school that day, Elijah noticed the faint red mark on her hand. He frowned, his concern evident as he reached out to touch her wrist. "Amara, what happened?" he asked, his voice filled with alarm. She pulled her hand back, hiding it behind her books. "It's nothing," she mumbled, avoiding his gaze. Elijah's brow furrowed, but he didn't push her. Instead, he simply gave her a reassuring look, a silent promise that he was there for her, even if she wasn't ready to share her burden. The days continued, each one blending into the next as Amara endured Mr. Jenkins' cruelty in silence. She grew quieter, more withdrawn, her once bright smile fading as the weight of his actions pressed down on her. She tried to stay strong, to hold on to the belief that things would get better, but the strain was beginning to take its toll. One evening, as she sat at the dinner table with her mother, Linda noticed the change in her daughter. She reached across the table, her hand resting gently on Amara's. "Sweetheart, is everything okay?" Linda asked, her voice filled with concern. Amara forced a smile, nodding quickly. "Yeah, Mom, just tired from school." But Linda wasn't convinced. She studied her daughter, her gaze soft but probing, as though she could see through the walls Amara had built around herself. She didn't press further, but Amara could sense her mother's worry, a small comfort in the midst of her loneliness. As she lay in bed that night, Amara stared at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of Mr. Jenkins, of his smirk, the cold glint in his eyes. She felt a surge of anger, a frustration that burned deep within her. She didn't deserve this. No one did. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to tell anyone, to let them see the pain she was carrying. But deep down, she knew something had to change. She couldn't keep enduring this, couldn't let Mr. Jenkins continue to make her feel small, invisible. She was stronger than that. She had to be. As sleep finally claimed her, Amara made a silent promise to herself. She would find a way to stand up for herself no matter how hard it might be. She wasn't going to let Mr. Jenkins win. Not this time. The morning began like any other, with Amara standing at her usual spot by the curb, her eyes fixed on the bend in the road where the yellow school bus would soon appear. She had steeled herself for yet another day of being ignored, for the ritual humiliation that had become a part of her daily routine. But today there was a subtle shift in the air, a tension she couldn't quite place. As she stood there, hugging her backpack, she saw the bus turn the corner. Her heart skipped a beat, her body instinctively tensing. She tried to steady her breathing, to keep her expression neutral, even though she knew that, once again, Mr. Jenkins would likely pass her by. The bus drew closer, and Amara clenched her fists, trying to prepare herself for the inevitable. But, to her surprise, the bus began to slow down, the rumbling of its engine softening as it rolled to a stop directly in front of her. She blinked, momentarily stunned, a flicker of hope sparking within her chest. Mr. Jenkins sat in the driver's seat, his face unreadable as he looked at her through the glass. She hesitated, unsure if this was some kind of trick, but when he opened the door, she took a cautious step forward, her heart pounding. She placed one foot on the bus's first step, gripping the handrail as she looked up at him. His gaze was cold, unyielding, but he didn't say anything. She took another step, trying to ignore the tension in the air, the way her skin prickled under his gaze. Then, without warning, he reached out and pushed her. The force of his hand caught her off balance, and before she could react, she felt herself falling backward, her foot slipping off the step. She tried to grab onto something, anything, but her fingers only scraped against the cold metal of the bus door as she tumbled onto the pavement. The world seemed to slow down as she hit the ground, the impact sending a sharp jolt of pain through her body. Her hands scraped against the rough asphalt, and she could feel the sting of fresh cuts on her palms. Her knee throbbed where it had hit the pavement, and she blinked, trying to clear the dizziness from her vision. The bus door slammed shut, and through the haze of pain, she saw Mr. Jenkins smirk as he looked down at her. He didn't say a word, just closed the door, pulled away, and drove off, leaving her lying there on the cold, unforgiving ground. Amara lay there for a moment, too stunned to move, the ache in her body dull compared to the raw, burning humiliation that coursed through her. She could feel the sting of tears welling up in her eyes, but she forced them back, biting down on her lip until she tasted blood. She wouldn't let him see her cry, even if he was already gone. Slowly, she pushed herself up, her body trembling as she forced herself to stand. Her palms were raw and bleeding, her knee bruised and swollen, but she clenched her fists, refusing to give in to the pain. She wouldn't let Mr. Jenkins win. Not today. The walk to school felt endless, each step sending a fresh wave of pain through her injured knee. But she kept her head high, her jaw set in determination. She wouldn't let anyone see her weakness, wouldn't let them know what had happened. She had endured worse. She could endure this. When she finally arrived at school, she went straight to the bathroom, locking herself in a stall as she inspected her injuries. Her hands were scraped and bloody, and her knee was a mottled mess of purple and red, the skin raw and bruised. She took a deep breath, willing herself to stay calm, to hold herself together. She washed her hands as best she could, wincing as the water stung her open cuts. She dabbed at her knee with a damp paper towel, gritting her teeth against the pain. She didn't have any bandages, but she wrapped her knee as tightly as she could with some tissue, hoping it would hold until she got home. For the rest of the day, Amara moved through her classes in a daze, her mind replaying the morning's events over and over. She could still feel the cold, hard ground beneath her, the sting of Mr. Jenkins' gaze as he watched her fall. The memory sent a fresh wave of anger and shame coursing through her, but she pushed it down, burying it deep within herself. At lunch, Elijah noticed her quietness, the way she avoided meeting his gaze. He reached across the table, his hand brushing against hers as he looked at her with concern. "Amara," he said gently, "are you okay?" She forced a smile, nodding quickly. "I'm fine, Eli. Just tired, that's all." But he didn't look convinced. His gaze drifted down to her hands, and he frowned when he saw the faint traces of blood on her palms. "What happened?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. Amara's heart pounded, panic rising in her chest. She hadn't meant for him to see, hadn't wanted him to know, but she couldn't lie to him, not when he was looking at her with such genuine concern. "It's nothing," she mumbled, pulling her hands away. "I just tripped on my way to school." Elijah didn't say anything for a moment, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. He knew her too well to believe her lie, but he didn't press her. Instead, he simply reached out and squeezed her hand, a silent gesture of support that made her chest tighten. After school, the walk home felt even longer than usual. Each step sent a fresh jolt of pain through her knee, but she kept going, gritting her teeth as she fought through the discomfort. When she finally arrived home, her mother was waiting for her, a worried frown on her face. "Amara?" Linda said, her voice soft but filled with concern. "What happened to you?" Amara hesitated, her heart pounding as she looked down at her bruised and scraped hands. She hadn't wanted her mother to know, hadn't wanted her to see the pain she was hiding. But Linda's gaze was gentle, understanding, and Amara felt the walls she'd built around herself begin to crumble. Taking a shaky breath, she looked up at her mother, her voice barely a whisper as she spoke. I fell," she said, her voice trembling. "Mr. Jenkins. He pushed me." Linda's face went pale, her eyes widening in shock and anger. She reached out, gently taking Amara's hands in her own as she inspected the raw, bloody scrapes. "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Amara felt a tear slip down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away, ashamed of her weakness. "I didn't want to bother you," she whispered. I thought I could handle it on my own." Linda pulled her into a tight embrace, her arms wrapping around her daughter as she held her close. "You don't have to go through this alone, Amara," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "You deserve to be treated with respect, and I won't let anyone make you feel less than you are." Amara clung to her mother, the weight of her emotions finally breaking through the surface. She sobbed into Linda's shoulder, all the pain and humiliation she'd been holding in spilling out in a flood of tears. Linda held her, stroking her hair and murmuring soft words of comfort. When Amara's sobs finally subsided, Linda pulled back, her gaze filled with determination. "We're going to do something about this," she said firmly. "No one has the right to treat you this way. Not him, not anyone." Amara nodded, a spark of hope igniting within her chest. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of relief, a glimmer of reassurance that maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. As they sat together, Amara felt a renewed sense of strength, a quiet determination that filled her heart. She wasn't alone. She had her mother by her side, and together they would fight for justice, for respect. And she would make sure that Mr. Jenkins' cruelty would not go unanswered. This was only the beginning. Linda could barely sleep that night. The thought of someone hurting her daughter filled her with a mix of anger and sadness, emotions that refused to settle even as the clock ticked into the early hours of the morning. She lay awake, replaying Amara's words in her mind, how she'd held back, trying to handle the pain on her own. The bruises, the scraped palms, the fear and resignation in her daughter's eyes. It was all too much to bear. As the morning sun finally broke over the horizon, Linda knew what she had to do. She wasn't just Amara's mother, she was a journalist, someone who had spent years uncovering injustices and speaking out for those who couldn't. Today, she would use every tool at her disposal to protect her daughter. After making breakfast and seeing Amara off to school, Linda wasted no time. She called a few parents from Amara's class, people she knew from PTA meetings and school events, hoping to gather any information that might help. The initial responses were supportive but hesitant. No one wanted to believe that a school bus driver, a trusted figure in their children's daily lives, could act with such cruelty. Linda felt frustration gnawing at her, but she persisted, hoping that someone would know something, anything, that could support Amara's story. Then, just as she was about to give up, one mother, a friend of a friend, someone she'd only spoken to briefly at school functions, mentioned that her son had seen Mr. Jenkins acting strangely around Amara, that he'd mentioned Mr. Jenkins ignoring her several times when she'd waited for the bus. Linda's heart raced. It wasn't a direct accusation, but it was something, a small validation of Amara's experience. She pressed further, asking if her son would be willing to speak up. The mother hesitated, her voice filled with concern. "I don't want to put him in a difficult position," she said softly, "but if it comes to it, we'll do what's right." With renewed energy, Linda began pulling at every thread she could find. She reached out to her journalist colleagues, people she trusted, explaining the situation in the vaguest terms. Several colleagues offered advice, and one suggested that she request access to the school district's formal complaint system, a process that would require her to submit a written report documenting every incident. Linda took notes, her mind racing with plans. The next step was clear. That afternoon, she made her way to the school administration office. The principal, Mrs. Carlyle, was a woman Linda had met a few times at school events, a well-meaning but somewhat cautious person who tended to avoid confrontation. Linda knew this meeting would require both diplomacy and determination. "Thank you for meeting with me on such short notice," Linda said as she took a seat in Mrs. Carlyle's small, neat office. Mrs. Carlyle nodded, her hands folded on the desk. "Of course, Mrs. Hayes. How can I help you?" Linda took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I'm here because of an issue with one of your school bus drivers, Mr. Jenkins. My daughter, Amara, she's been having issues with him for some time now. I believe he's been intentionally mistreating her, and yesterday, he hurt her." Mrs. Carlyle's eyes widened slightly, her expression shifting to one of concern. "I'm so sorry to hear that, Mrs. Hayes. But are you sure this isn't a misunderstanding? Mr. Jenkins has been with us for years. He's always been reliable." Linda's jaw clenched, but she forced herself to stay calm. "This isn't a misunderstanding," she replied firmly. "I know my daughter, and I know she wouldn't make something like this up. I've already spoken to other parents, and some of their children have seen Mr. Jenkins acting inappropriately around Amara." Mrs. Carlyle's face softened, a hint of empathy creeping into her gaze. "I see. Well, if you believe there's a problem, we can certainly look into it. But these things take time, and we'll need to gather evidence." Linda leaned forward, her voice unwavering. "With all due respect, Mrs. Carlyle, my daughter doesn't have time to wait while Mr. Jenkins continues his behavior. She deserves to feel safe on her way to school. I'm asking you to start a formal investigation immediately." The principal hesitated, glancing down at the papers on her desk before nodding. "All right, Mrs. Hayes. I'll initiate the process. But please understand that Mr. Jenkins will be notified, and this could complicate matters." Linda didn't flinch. "I understand, but this is about my daughter's safety, and I won't let anyone make her feel small or unworthy. Not him, not anyone." With that, Linda stood, offering a brief nod before leaving the office. As she walked down the school hallway, her mind churned with plans. She knew that simply filing a complaint might not be enough. She'd have to make this story known, give voice to Amara's experience so that others would listen. Over the next few days, Linda began crafting an article. It was challenging to write about something so personal, to find the balance between sharing Amara's experience and protecting her privacy. She chose her words carefully, aiming to highlight the broader issue of discrimination and mistreatment within school systems, rather than focusing solely on Mr. Jenkins. Late at night, after Amara had gone to bed, Linda sat alone at her desk, her laptop screen glowing softly in the dim light. She poured her heart into the piece, describing the pain and frustration of watching her daughter suffer, the helplessness she'd felt as a mother, and the strength she found in standing up against injustice. She wrote about the importance of listening to children, of believing them when they say something is wrong. When she finally finished the article, she read it over, her eyes lingering on each word. She knew it would be difficult for Amara, that it might bring unwanted attention, but she also knew that silence would do more harm. She would protect her daughter no matter what. The next morning, Linda showed Amara the article before submitting it. Amara read it carefully, her expression serious as her eyes scanned the screen. When she finished, she looked up at her mother, her gaze filled with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. "Are you sure about this, Mom?" she asked softly. What if people don't believe us?" Linda reached out, taking her daughter's hand in her own. "Some people might doubt us," she admitted, "but there are others who need to hear this, people who will support us. And as long as we have each other, we'll get through this." Amara nodded, her grip tightening around her mother's hand. "Thank you, Mom, for believing in me." Linda smiled, a surge of pride filling her chest. "I'll always believe in you, sweetheart. You're stronger than you know." With Amara's blessing, Linda submitted the article to her editor, and within a few days, it was published. The response was overwhelming. Parents, teachers, and even strangers reached out to Linda, sharing their own stories of discrimination and mistreatment, expressing their support for Amara. It became clear that her story was not an isolated incident. Many others had faced similar challenges, and Linda's article had given them the courage to speak out. One by one, parents began coming forward, sharing experiences their children had had with Mr. Jenkins. Some were hesitant at first, fearing retaliation, but as more stories emerged, a collective voice began to grow, a demand for accountability that the school administration could no longer ignore. Linda organized a meeting with these parents, gathering them in a community center one evening. They shared their stories, each one a testament to the need for change, to the power of unity in the face of adversity. Amara stood quietly by her mother's side, listening to the stories with wide eyes. She saw the strength in these parents, the love they had for their children, and a sense of pride swelled within her. Just as the meeting came to a close, Linda addressed the group, her voice steady and filled with conviction. "Thank you all for being here," she began. "For too long, we've allowed people like Mr. Jenkins to mistreat our children without consequence. But today, we stand together. We demand respect, accountability, and justice, not just for Amara, but for every child who has ever felt small or unworthy. This is just the beginning, and I promise you, we won't stop until every voice is heard." The room erupted in applause, parents nodding in agreement, their faces filled with determination. For the first time in weeks, Amara felt a glimmer of hope, a sense of relief that maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. As she walked home with her mother that night, Amara looked up at the stars, a feeling of peace settling over her. She knew there would still be challenges ahead, that the fight was far from over, but she also knew that she wasn't alone. She had her mother, her friends, and an entire community by her side, and together they would make sure that no child ever had to feel invisible again. The morning light streamed through the kitchen window as Linda scrolled through her email, her inbox overflowing with messages. Parents, teachers, and people from across the city had reached out, moved by the story she had shared. The words she had written about Amara's struggles had resonated with countless others, sparking an outcry she hadn't fully anticipated. Linda felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as she read through the messages. Some emails were heartfelt and supportive, with parents recounting similar experiences their children had faced. Others were more guarded, doubting her story or suggesting that she had misinterpreted Mr. Jenkins' actions. But Linda knew the truth, and each story shared with her only solidified her resolve. At the center of the storm was Amara. That morning, she sat across from her mother at the kitchen table, her face a mixture of emotions. She was grateful for the support and the solidarity shown by so many, yet she couldn't shake the nerves that accompanied such exposure. Amara had always been private, keeping her struggles to herself, and now her story was in the hands of strangers. "Mom," she said softly, breaking the silence, "do you think this will really change anything?" Linda looked up from her screen, a gentle smile softening her expression. "I do, sweetheart. Change doesn't come easily, but it starts with people being brave enough to speak up. You've done something incredibly brave, and now others are following your lead." Amara nodded, though doubt still lingered in her eyes. She had seen firsthand how people could look away, choosing to ignore things they found uncomfortable or inconvenient. But Linda's belief in her, in the power of their story, gave her a glimmer of hope. The article had been published just 2 days earlier, but its impact was already rippling through the community. Local news outlets picked up the story, and the school administration found itself under pressure to respond. The principal, Mrs. Carlisle, had called an emergency meeting with the school board, promising parents that they would take appropriate action. But Linda knew that promises weren't enough. She'd been in journalism long enough to understand that words could be hollow, that real change required persistence. That morning, she sat at her laptop, drafting follow-up emails to local news stations, arranging interviews, and reaching out to advocacy groups that specialized in educational reform and children's rights. As she typed, Amara sat beside her, watching her mother with a mixture of admiration and awe. Linda was relentless, determined, and focused, qualities that Amara had always admired. It was strange, yet comforting, to see her mother fight so fiercely for her, to see her transform into a force of nature that nothing could deter. By afternoon, Linda's phone began to ring with requests for interviews, local journalists eager to cover the story that had captivated the community. Linda hesitated, glancing at Amara. "Only if you're comfortable with this, honey," she said softly. "This is your story, after all. I want you to have a say in how we share it." Amara thought for a moment, her gaze drifting to the window as she considered her mother's words. The idea of speaking to strangers, of sharing her experiences so publicly, was daunting. But then she remembered the faces of the other children she'd seen at the community meeting, their shy smiles and supportive glances. They were counting on her, in a way, to help pave the path forward. "Okay," she replied, her voice quiet but steady. "I want people to know what happened. Maybe it'll stop this from happening to someone else." Linda smiled, a glimmer of pride in her eyes. "You're a brave girl, Amara. I'm so proud of you." The first interview took place that evening. A small crew from the local news station set up their equipment in the living room, the camera lights casting a warm glow over the space. Amara sat beside her mother, her hands tightly clasped in her lap, as the reporter asked her gentle but probing questions about her experiences with Mr. Jenkins. As Amara spoke, she could feel the weight of her words, the way each sentence seemed to solidify her pain, her fear, and her determination. She recounted the countless mornings she'd stood alone at the curb, the cold indifference in Mr. Jenkins' eyes as he passed her by. She spoke about the moment he'd pushed her, the way she'd felt so small, so invisible, and the strength she'd found in her mother's support. When the interview ended, Amara felt a strange sense of relief. She had spoken her truth, put her story out into the world, and there was no turning back. The reporter thanked them, promising to handle the story with care and respect, and soon the crew left, leaving the house quiet once more. Over the next few days, the story gained momentum. The community rallied around Amara and Linda, with parents organizing a petition to demand Mr. Jenkins' suspension pending a formal investigation. The local news station aired Amara's interview, sparking even more support and empathy from viewers. Parents reached out to Linda, sharing stories of discrimination their children had faced, some even recalling their own painful memories from school. One evening, Linda organized a gathering at the community center, inviting parents and children who had been impacted by similar experiences. Amara was nervous, unsure what to expect, but when she arrived, she was met with kind smiles, warm handshakes, and encouraging words. Parents shared stories of their children's struggles, recounting incidents of bullying, neglect, and prejudice that had left lasting scars. As Linda stood at the front of the room listening to each story, she felt a sense of purpose like never before. She had spent her career fighting for justice, but this was personal. This was about her daughter, about giving a voice to the children who had been silenced for too long. When it was her turn to speak, Linda addressed the crowd, her voice filled with determination. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her gaze sweeping across the room. "What happened to Amara should never have happened, and it breaks my heart to know that so many of you have similar stories. But today, we're here to make sure that no child has to go through this again. We're here to demand accountability, respect, and dignity for our children." The room filled with applause, parents nodding in agreement, their faces filled with determination. Amara felt a surge of pride as she watched her mother speak, realizing just how powerful her voice could be. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, things would change. As the meeting continued, Linda introduced the idea of creating a parent-led committee to advocate for school reform, to ensure that incidents like Amara's wouldn't be brushed aside in the future. The idea was met with enthusiasm, and within minutes, parents volunteered to join the committee, offering their time and resources to help bring about change. After the meeting, as they walked home together, Amara looked up at her mother, a mixture of gratitude and admiration in her eyes. "Thank you, Mom," she said softly, for everything." Linda wrapped an arm around her daughter, pulling her close. "You're worth every bit of this, sweetheart, and you deserve to be treated with respect, always." Amara smiled, feeling a warmth settle in her chest. She knew that there would still be challenges ahead, that change wouldn't come easily, but she also knew that she wasn't alone. She had her mother by her side, a community that believed in her, and a strength within herself that she hadn't known existed. As they reached their front door, Amara felt a sense of peace. The journey was far from over, but she was ready to face whatever came next. Together, they would continue the fight, and no matter what happened, she knew she had a voice that mattered. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. The anticipation in the room was palpable. Parents, teachers, administrators, and even a few journalists filled the seats, their murmured conversations blending into a low hum of voices. At the front of the room sat the school board members, their expressions a mixture of weariness and tension. This meeting was unlike any other they'd held. It was a call for justice, and everyone in the room felt its weight. Amara sat next to her mother, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She could feel the tension in her muscles, the way her heart raced with a mix of fear and determination. Linda reached over, giving her daughter's hand a gentle squeeze. Amara looked up, meeting her mother's steady gaze, and felt a surge of strength. This was their moment to be heard, to demand the respect and accountability that had been denied for so long. Across the room, Mr. Jenkins sat alone, his face unreadable. He glanced around the room, his gaze flickering over each person present, but he didn't meet Amara's eyes. His usual smugness had been replaced by a wariness, a guardedness that made him seem smaller than she had ever seen him. For the first time, it was as if he understood that he could no longer hide behind the bus doors, no longer ignore her with a simple slam of the door. Today, he would have to face the consequences of his actions. The principal, Mrs. Carlyle, opened the meeting with a brief address, her tone serious and composed. She welcomed everyone, acknowledging the difficult nature of the discussion they were about to have. Linda listened intently, her gaze fixed on Mrs. Carlyle, but Amara could feel her mother's tension, the way her fingers tapped lightly against her knee, a habit she had when she was holding back anger. Then it was Linda's turn to speak. She stood, her posture straight, her eyes scanning the room as she prepared to address the crowd. There was a pause, a silence that settled over the room as everyone turned their attention to her. "My name is Linda Hayes," she began, her voice calm yet filled with conviction. "I'm here today as a mother and as a journalist, but most importantly, I'm here on behalf of my daughter, Amara." She glanced down at Amara, giving her a reassuring smile before continuing. "For months, my daughter endured mistreatment on her way to school. She was ignored, humiliated, and, in one instance, even physically harmed by someone who was supposed to ensure her safety." Linda's gaze shifted to Mr. Jenkins, her eyes steady and unyielding. Mr. Jenkins, as the driver of the school bus, had a responsibility to treat every child with respect and dignity, but he chose to do otherwise. A murmur ran through the crowd, parents nodding in agreement, their faces filled with a mixture of anger and sympathy. Linda paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. "This isn't just about Amara. It's about every child who has ever been made to feel small, who has ever been told, directly or indirectly, that they don't matter." Linda's voice grew stronger, a passion igniting in her words. "We are here today to demand accountability, to make it clear that such behavior will not be tolerated." As she finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. Amara felt a warmth spread through her chest, a sense of pride and gratitude for her mother's unwavering support. She glanced at Mr. Jenkins, wondering if he felt any remorse, any sense of responsibility for what he'd done, but his expression remained impassive, his eyes fixed on a spot just above Linda's head. Then it was Mr. Jenkins' turn to speak. He stood, his movements slow and deliberate, and adjusted his tie, his gaze shifting nervously around the room. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but lacking the confidence it usually held. I've been a bus driver for many years," he began, his tone defensive. "I've driven countless children to and from school, and I've always done my job to the best of my ability." There was a pause as he glanced at the school board members as though searching for validation, but their faces remained neutral, waiting for him to continue. "I never intended to make anyone feel uncomfortable or unwelcome," he said, his eyes flicking briefly in Amara's direction. "If Miss Hayes felt that I treated her unfairly, then I apologize. But I believe there may have been some misunderstandings." The room fell silent, tension crackling in the air. Linda's jaw tightened, and Amara could feel her mother's frustration, the way her hands clenched at her sides. The word misunderstanding hung in the air, a feeble attempt to downplay the pain he had caused. A parent from the crowd, a father with his son sitting beside him, stood up. "A misunderstanding?" he echoed, his voice filled with disbelief. "My son told me he saw you close the door in Amara's face more than once. How is that a misunderstanding?" Other parents began murmuring in agreement, their voices growing louder as they shared their own experiences. The room buzzed with anger, with a collective demand for answers that Mr. Jenkins couldn't ignore. He looked around, his face paling as he realized the depth of the resentment he had stirred. I didn't realize," he stammered, his voice faltering. "I didn't think." Linda stood again, her voice cutting through the noise. "Mr. Jenkins, you may not have realized the full extent of the harm you were causing, but that doesn't absolve you of responsibility. Ignorance is not an excuse for cruelty." Mr. Jenkins' gaze dropped to the floor, his shoulders slumping as the weight of Linda's words settled over him. For the first time, Amara saw something that resembled shame flicker across his face, a fleeting moment of vulnerability that made him seem almost human. The principal raised a hand, calling for quiet. When the room had settled, she looked at Mr. Jenkins, her expression stern. "Mr. Jenkins, based on the testimonies we've heard today and the formal complaints that have been filed, the school board has decided to suspend you pending a full investigation. We take these allegations seriously, and we will not tolerate any behavior that compromises the safety and well-being of our students." A sense of relief washed over Amara as she heard the principal's words, a weight lifting from her shoulders. She glanced at her mother, who gave her a small, encouraging smile. They had done it. They had been heard. Mr. Jenkins said nothing, his face pale as he slumped back into his seat. The room remained silent for a moment, a collective breath held as the reality of the situation sank in. For Amara, it was a moment of validation, of justice, a moment she would carry with her for the rest of her life. As the meeting came to a close, parents began to stand, offering words of support and solidarity to Linda and Amara. They shook hands, shared knowing glances, a silent acknowledgement of the strength it took to stand up and demand justice. On the way out, Amara felt a gentle tap on her shoulder. She turned to see a group of her classmates, their faces filled with admiration and respect. "We're proud of you, Amara," one of them said softly, a shy smile on her face. "You're really brave." Amara felt a warmth spread through her chest, a sense of belonging that she hadn't felt in a long time. She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes, and nodded in gratitude. As they walked home, Linda wrapped an arm around Amara's shoulders, pulling her close. "You did amazing today, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice filled with pride. Amara leaned into her mother's embrace, feeling a peace settle over her. She had faced her fears, stood up against someone who had tried to make her feel small, and she had won. And in that moment, she knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she was stronger than she'd ever realized. The fight wasn't over. There was still work to be done. But for now, Amara allowed herself to feel the triumph, the relief, the quiet joy of knowing that she had a voice that mattered, a voice that had been heard. And that was more powerful than any words Mr. Jenkins could ever say. Months passed since the school board's decision to suspend Mr. Jenkins. The memory of that meeting lingered in Amara's mind like a vivid dream, a turning point in her young life that she revisited often. The feelings of relief and pride hadn't faded, and as the days grew warmer with the approach of summer, she felt a new sense of freedom and confidence in her daily routines. Linda noticed the changes in her daughter. Amara held her head a little higher, her voice was more assured, and there was a brightness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Amara's courage had changed both of them, drawing them closer and inspiring Linda to continue her advocacy work with renewed purpose. One evening, as Linda sorted through the day's mail, she found a plain, unmarked envelope addressed to her. She opened it slowly, her gaze sharpening as she read the familiar name on the letterhead, Mr. Jenkins. She took a deep breath, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded the letter. "Amara," she called, her voice gentle yet firm. Amara came into the room, her brow furrowing when she saw the look on her mother's face. "What is it, Mom?" Linda held out the letter, her expression unreadable. "It's from Mr. Jenkins. I think he's apologizing." Amara's heart skipped a beat, a mixture of emotions flooding through her. Surprise, disbelief, even a hint of resentment. She hadn't thought much about Mr. Jenkins since his suspension. In her mind, she had already closed that chapter of her life. But now, faced with his letter, she felt an old tension resurface, memories of pain and humiliation flicker into life. Linda offered her a gentle smile. "You don't have to read it if you don't want to. This is your choice." Amara stared at the envelope for a moment, her mind racing. She had questions, unresolved feelings, and though part of her wanted to ignore the letter, another part of her needed to see what he had to say. Taking a deep breath, she reached out, unfolding the letter as her eyes scanned the carefully written words. "Dear Amara, I don't expect you to forgive me, and I understand if you'd rather not read this. But I feel it's my duty to acknowledge the pain I caused and to apologize sincerely. Looking back, I realize how my actions hurt you. I let my own prejudices, my own misguided views, influence the way I treated you, and for that I am deeply sorry. There is no excuse for the way I behaved. You did not deserve any of it. I'm ashamed of the choices I made, and I will carry that shame with me. You are a strong, intelligent young woman, and you showed more courage than I ever did. I hope that you continue to use your voice to stand up for what is right. Again, I am sorry. I'm working on becoming a better person, someone who values all people equally, and I hope that one day you might find it in your heart to forgive me. Sincerely, Harold Jenkins." As she finished reading, Amara felt a swirl of emotions, anger, sadness, and, surprisingly, a faint sense of compassion. She hadn't expected this, hadn't thought that Mr. Jenkins would ever acknowledge his actions, let alone apologize for them. For so long, he had seemed cold and unrepentant, a symbol of the prejudice she had faced. But now, in his own words, he had admitted his fault, his regret. Linda watched her carefully, waiting, not wanting to influence her reaction. "How do you feel?" she asked gently. Amara was quiet for a moment, her gaze fixed on the letter. I don't know," she admitted. "I'm still angry at him, but I think he really means it." Linda nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Forgiveness is a personal choice, Amara. You don't have to forgive him if you're not ready, but sometimes letting go of anger can be freeing. It's up to you." Amara looked down, considering her mother's words. Forgiving Mr. Jenkins wouldn't erase what he had done, wouldn't take away the pain he had caused, but holding on to that anger was exhausting, a weight that she realized she didn't want to carry anymore. Slowly, she folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. Maybe I can forgive him one day," she said quietly. "But for now, I just want to focus on moving forward." Linda smiled, pride shining in her eyes. "That's a wise choice, sweetheart. You've already shown so much strength." As the days passed, Amara found herself thinking less about Mr. Jenkins and more about her future, her goals, and her dreams. She poured herself into her studies, excelling in her classes with a renewed sense of purpose. Her friends and teachers noticed the change, complimenting her on her confidence, her determination. One morning, as she waited by the curb for the school bus, she felt a familiar pang of anxiety. The memory of countless mornings standing there, ignored and humiliated, still lingered. But today was different. The bus rolled up to the curb, and as the doors opened, a new driver greeted her with a warm smile. "Good morning," he said cheerfully, nodding as she stepped on board. "I'm Mr. Thompson. You must be Amara." Amara nodded, a shy smile tugging at her lips. "Yes, that's me." Mr. Thompson gestured to the empty seats. "Well, hop on in. I'm glad to have you with us, Amara." She felt a warmth spread through her chest as she found a seat, the weight of her past fears melting away. She looked out the window, watching as the familiar streets passed by, feeling a sense of peace and closure. As she settled in, Amara thought back to the months of struggle, the pain she had endured, and the strength she had found within herself. She had learned that her voice mattered, that she had the power to stand up against injustice. She had faced her fears, fought for her right to be seen and respected, and come out stronger on the other side. When the bus arrived at school, Amara stepped off, her head held high, her heart filled with gratitude and pride. She was no longer the quiet girl standing on the edge of the curb, hoping for kindness. She was Amara Hayes, a young woman who knew her worth, who had faced her fears and emerged victorious. As she walked into the school building, she felt a new path unfolding before her, one filled with possibilities and promise. She didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but she knew she was ready to face them. Because now, she knew that she was strong. She knew that her voice had the power to make a difference. And that knowledge was more powerful than any apology, any regret. It was hers to carry, a reminder of the journey she had taken and the strength she had found along the way. Thank you for watching this video. If you like the story, don't forget to give us a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. We have many more exciting stories to come, and we look forward to seeing you again. Also, feel free to check out our previous videos. There are a lot of fascinating stories there. See you in the next video.